All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us here for our second session. We're super excited to have you again. This session, April will be speaking again on some of her different experiences that she's had with steering committees and governance boards throughout her career. So I will let her start.
Hi, welcome back. I hope you're not sick of listening to me talk. I will try, I promise, to keep it interesting. So I'm going to go over 4 different projects that had steering committees. The projects are as follows. I'll go from past to work toward present. The first was a project that I participated in with the MTA, New York MTA. It was a $650 million project. It ran from 2005 to 2011. The customer project was the Integrated Electronic Security System. The vendor on the project was Lockheed Martin, and the contract ended in mutual default. The next one was the state of Connecticut. The contract was for $46 million. It ran from 2011 to 2013. The customer was building something called the Criminal Justice Information System, CGIS. The vendor was Xerox, and the contract was forfeited by Xerox. These are in red. That indicates that they were vendor-customer type projects. So the transaction was vendor-customer. The next 2 were blue. The transaction was customer provider. So they were kind of all internal. And these were transactions with multiple competing customer internal needs. The next one was the UCONN Center for Public Health and Health Policy. It ran between 2013 and 2015. The customer was building a project called P20WIN. It stood for Preschool to Age 20 Workforce Integration Network. The vendor was, the internal provider was UCONN Health, UCONN BCAT, I'll get that acronym in a minute, and a company called Open Clinica, and the 3 of them had a joint venture. The contract ended with the customer defaulting the vendor. And the last one was Northwell Health Solutions Division, and it ran from 2015 to 2018. It's ongoing. I left in 2018 to join SUNY. The customer was the Population Healthcare Management Programs, and the vendor was Allscripts, and it was an internal vendor, and the contract is ongoing. So each of these had governing boards, and the governance mandate, some of the options for governance mandates for all of these steering committees were, you could pick from this list for any of these steering committees, was to ensure project success, to monitor cost, scope, and schedule, to monitor quality, risk, and issues, to maintain alignment of priorities, to present project descriptions, to improve project morale, to clarify requirements, to resolve issues and conflicts, to approve scope changes, to escalate risks, issues, and conflicts, and to protect the contract. And so I'll move on to the first contract. Okay, MTA. This is what the stack looked like. At the top, the sponsor was the MTA Board of Directors and the MTA Chairman. During the term of the contract, which was 05 to 011, we went through 3 chairmen of the board of MTA. Calico, Warner, and Lahota. Anyway, we went through 3 chairmen of the board. So the sponsor changed 3 times during the course of the project. We had not one, but 3 steering committees. The project management office was performed by a third party, which was Parsons Transportation Group. There were many working groups. There was one for less than lethal. There was one for training. There was a working group for active shooter. There was a working group for package left behind. There was one for profiling, terrorist profiling. There was one for lie detection. There was a working group for NIMS, which is the National Incident Management System. And there was one for APTA, which is the American Public Transportation Association, and a couple of others. I served on training, package left behind, filing, lie detection, NIMS, and APTA. And then at the bottom were the various agencies and their design and construction teams from the vendor. The Integrated Electronic Security System was a project of the MTA Office of Security. It was fulfilled primarily by the MTA Capital Construction Company. The subsidiary agencies were Metro North Railroad, Long Island Railroad, Staten Island Railroad, and MTA Bus. The affiliates were Bridges and Tunnels, New York City Transit, and New York City Transit Police. The vendor was Lockheed Martin. There were multiple subcontractors. The job was 70% construction, 30% IT. The project used the waterfall method, and the requirements traceability matrix had 15,000 requirements. So this was a large project over many years with many requirements. And let's talk about some of the steering committees that were involved in this project. So as you recall in my first presentation, I said that the reason that projects benefit from project management is because they are transactional, they are competitive, and they are matrixed. And I use 3 categories to describe each of the projects that I've presented here. In this MTA contract, it was transactional, and the type of transaction was a customer and an outside vendor. And the type of transactional relationship it was highly adversarial. It started out highly adversarial. It was an us versus them type of contract. Lockheed Martin in this contract were basically what we call change order artists. The contract was originally written, let's see, what did it end up being? $6.5 million. The contract was originally written for about $4.5 million. They were the lowest bidder. It was a lowest bidder kind of contract. There were 3 or 4 pre-qualified bidders, and they were the lowest bidder. Within 3 months of winning the bid, there was an ad in the New York Times for a change order manager for Lockheed Martin on this contract. And they put in the ad that the change order manager would be handling change orders in the amount of $250 to $300 million. So we knew right away that they planned on increasing the value of the contract via change orders by 50% of what the contract was worth. So we knew right away that they planned on change ordering up the contract 50% for 50% greater than it was worth. So that was part of their business plan. They also used contract default as part of their business model. By that I mean that they took the contract apart, they ranked the easiest and most lucrative parts of the contract first in their project schedule. They next ranked the next level of difficulty and profitability in their project schedule. And then the parts of the contract that were the most difficult and the least profitable, they just tossed out and had no intention of doing. And so they worked the contract so that they took all the work out of the they performed all the work in the contract that was the least effort and the most profit. And then when they reached that point, they stopped performing on the contract and defaulted MTA as a customer. That's their business model. When I say that the contract was very adversarial, from during the first month of working with Lockheed Martin, I personally was assaulted by their contract rep. I mentioned something to him about something in the contract that needed to be worked out, and he shoved me against a wall and said, "Don't mention that to anyone. We're not going to deal with that." And when I reported that assault, he was just moved to another agency, and we got a different rep. Their strategy was to bring in their A team for 6 months, and then their B team for 6 months, and then their C team for 6 months. And then after 2 years on the contract, they just closed their office and started sending their people somewhere else. This contract was destined to fail the minute we signed it. But it was interesting the way the steering committees were used to handle this contract, even though it was fated for failure from the beginning. And I always say that you can learn more from a failed project than you can from a successful project every time, even though it's extremely painful. And it's even more painful to have your failed projects described on the front page of the New York Times, as this one was. I wasn't in charge of the whole project, certainly, because I wasn't a member of MTA Capital Construction, but I was in charge of the Metro North portion of the work. I originally worked for Parsons Transportation, so I helped write the RFP, sections of the RFP, and then when the contract was let to Lockheed Martin, I was assigned to Metro North as their project manager for that part of the work. And then eventually, after several years, I was taken on as an employee of Metro North to manage the work once Parsons' contract ran out and Lockheed Martin walked away from the job. And Metro North and all the agencies had to complete the contract on their own. Okay, so that's a little overview. In the area of that's a little overview of the transactional aspect of the project. In the competitive arena, there was a lot of interagency competition, as you can imagine. Because of the nature of the adversarial transaction, the change orders became the area of competition among the agencies. The project was always under-resourced through time. They became less and less and less resourced as they brought in the weaker and weaker teams of fewer and fewer people. So Lockheed Martin and their contractors were always under-resourced. Lockheed Martin wasn't paying their contractors well, and so contractors were cutting back on their resources. So between the change orders costing us more in the budget and the resources dwindling, there was always a fight between the agencies for resources to get their portion of the work built. The work got to be poor and poor quality, and then the user acceptance testing was always a matter of taking everyone out to Floyd Field and not letting us leave until we signed off on the user acceptance testing. So it was always a hostage-taking situation. The matrixed portion of the work, having matrix teams, always ran very well because Parsons acted as the project management office for the work. And that meant that in terms of the project management components, the design documents, the test documents, transition documents, all of that sort of thing, the requirements traceability matrix, that management went very smoothly because it was all done by Parsons, which was a independent third party. They were neither MTA nor were they Lockheed Martin. And so there was no fighting about what was going on in the project management office and what items and objects were completed because Parsons were doing it as a third party. So basically, the vendor was not acting in good faith. And at the end of it in 2011, the contract was mutually defaulted by both parties. Lockheed Martin defaulted MTA on the contract, and MTA defaulted Lockheed Martin on the contract. They were still fighting it out in 2016, 2017. I lost track of it. For a while, I was expert witness in the trial, and then when my deal was done in about 2015, I quit keeping track of it. So I don't know how it was ever settled. So there were 3 steering committees in this project. The first was a project steering committee. This was run by Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin used this as their status reporting meeting. That was the mandate of this steering committee, is the vendor ran this steering committee to report their project status to the customer. The membership of this steering committee was Lockheed Martin and agency managers, and the agency, Lockheed Martin and the agency project managers, which would include Parson project managers. So they were managers, development managers, and project managers. And it was held biweekly. So biweekly, we would go to Lockheed Martin's offices, the customer, project managers, and the vendor. And we would hear status reports on the project. And, you know, you can imagine what they reported on. They reported on scope, schedule, budget, risks, issues, quality in terms of testing. And we would go through the requirements traceability matrix. We would talk about the traceability of requirements to design documents. And it was like all morning or all afternoon that we would work through this. And they would be representatives from all the agencies, but the meeting was always run by Lockheed Martin. Now, the purpose of this steering committee was basically Lockheed's it was, I'm going to put this as nicely as I can. It was Lockheed's attempt biweekly to align their vision of how the project was going onto the customer and the project managers. So they wanted to make sure that we could adopt their positive vision of the progress of the project, and they were presenting that to us. So it was very much one-way communication. So they would get us together and say, look how wonderful things are going. And there was some time set aside for communication back from the customer to the vendor, but it was a very small amount of time. So it was very heavy-handed in terms of the vendor providing information to the customer. So this was not really a two-way communication. This was one of those meetings that it was very kind of manipulative. So there was another meeting by the MTA steering committee. And this was just MTA, no vendors involved. Now, this was a great steering committee. This was the kind of steering committee that was a model steering committee. Its mandate was to adjudicate interagency conflict, to mediate agency vendor issues, to approve change orders, to monitor scope, schedule, cost, quality, and risk, and to escalate vendor risks and issues. The membership was agency decision makers, Parsons project managers and agency subject matter experts as needed. And when I say agency decision makers, that also includes their delegates, because very often agency decision makers couldn't attend monthly, so they would also send their delegates. So what would happen? This was the communication cycle. The vendor would have us all go to their project steering committee biweekly. Then out of that would come problems and issues, because we wouldn't necessarily agree with the rosy picture that they were presenting of the project status. There would be disagreements with what they were presenting, and since we couldn't work them out at this level, we couldn't work them out at the project steering committee level, because it wasn't actually a project steering committee. It was just a kind of a vendor presentation meeting. Then it would come back and generate problems with the competition, the interagency competition. So a lot of the interagency competition and the problems that we were having between the agencies were generated by the poor vendor performance. We all had change orders that we had to deal with, this massive $250,000 worth of change orders that we all had to find somewhere in our budget to pay for if we wanted the project to move forward. And we were under-resourced. And, the vendor was making the project extremely difficult for us. And so all these problems that were generated, we'd have to take to the MTA steering committee. And they did a masterful job of adjudicating it, I must say. It was led by the Office of the MTA Office of Security and MTA Capital Construction. And this mandate they fulfilled, and they did a great job of fulfilling this mandate. As I said, it was led by the Office of Security, and we'll go back here to this previous slide. It was led by the primary owners of the project, the Office of Security and MTA Capital Construction, and they mediated representatives from all of these agencies, their delegates, their subject matter experts, and the project managers from Parsons, of which I was one. And they did a great job adjudicating these conflicts, getting an accurate report of the status of all of these project vectors, approving disapproving change orders, which they had to because that impacted the budget, mediating the vendor issues, vendor agency issues, and escalating vendor risks and issues and conflicts. They did this on a monthly basis, and then anything they couldn't handle was escalated to this final committee right here. And this was the MTA Lockheed Martin Executive Committee. And you'll see this happen again in other projects, that when a steering committee can't handle something, they have to have somewhere to escalate it to. And it's very often between the executives of the customer and the vendor. And in this case, it was the MTA chairman and the Lockheed Martin division president and Parsons. And those three entities got together, and their primary mandate was to protect the contract. And in the end, they weren't able to. The contract was mutually defaulted by both parties. So the next one is...
April, can we pause for a moment to see if there's any questions that people want to ask?
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask about this steering committee example and governance?
Yeah, we're just keeping an eye on the time as well. We have about 24 minutes left.
Okay. The next one is the state of Connecticut criminal justice. Contract was $46 million, a little smaller. It went from 01 to, it didn't go from 01, it went from 11 to 13. Sorry about that. It was a project of the Criminal Justice Information System. The primary customer was the courts, and they did it on behalf of the Connecticut Court Support Services Division, local law enforcement, the Connecticut DMV, Connecticut Department of Corrections, Connecticut Department Board of Pardons and Parole, and one of the primary internal providers was the Bureau of Enterprise Systems Technology, which was the CIO's organization of development and data center. The vendor was Xerox. They had multiple subcontractors. It was implemented using rolling wave. The vendor was not on site, and the RTM was evolving. Oh, that's always a problem, an evolving requirements traceability matrix. The sponsor was the Connecticut Undersecretary for Criminal Justice. The reason the project was undertaken was because of the home invasion in Connecticut that killed those people. That was awful. Was that Cheshire? Chester? Chelsea? Oof. It was grisly. It was awful. Remember, a couple of pair of paroled convicts broke into somebody's house, held them hostage, killed them. Anyway, they found out that it was because they didn't have life cycle awareness, end-to-end life cycle awareness of prisoners, because all of these entities didn't share information. And it was really a brilliant project. Xerox had a wonderful product. Their subcontractors were top of the line. Xerox really wanted to break in here. They had a steering committee. They had a special organization set up for PMO. So the state of Connecticut had built a special organization called the Criminal Justice Information System, PMO. It had a director, it had project managers, it had technical designers and developers. They had subgroups to handle Medicare, housing, data, use case development, and data inventory for the project. And this is, like incarcerated Medicare, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, sorry. Incarcerated housing, incarcerated Medicare. And they had down here at the bottom a special division for design and development teams and project managers. And it also handled its own PMO. Okay, so transactionally, between the customer and the vendor, everything was very congenial. The contract was of strategic value to the vendor. They had great partners and superior technology. They really wanted to do the contract. In terms of the competitive nature of the contract, the agendas of the various agencies were divergent and poorly defined. The vision between the various agencies were vague and constantly shifting. And the priorities, the leader of the CJIS effort made every agency feel like they were number one. So there was no honest evaluation of priorities across the agencies. There was not really a matrixed organization. The work groups were not adequately resourced. There was no leadership from the CJIS group, and there was no two-way communication between the CJIS group and the organizations that they were building the product for. There was no requirements traceability matrix. This morning, we talked about a vaguely defined product. There was no requirements traceability matrix. And ultimately, the vendor, Xerox, forfeited the contract. They walked away. So this is what the steering committee looked like, the Connecticut Criminal Justice Steering Committee. Their mandate of this steering committee was product presentation, positive, in quotes, status reporting, not honest status reporting, and not status reporting on the key factors of project monitoring: cost, schedule, scope, quality, risk, and issues. But positive status reporting, and to avoid interagency conflict, not to mediate interagency conflict or adjudicate interagency conflict, but to avoid interagency conflict. Now, remember, there was very, very poor leadership in this group. The members were leaders from all the various agencies that I showed you on the previous page. So these are all the agencies within the state of Connecticut that dealt with criminal justice. the complete life cycle of someone in the criminal justice system, from where they were arrested at local law enforcement, went to court, dealt with court support services, went to the Department of Corrections, and then were paroled and released. So their complete life cycle in the corrections system. Also, DMV was in there because they handled registered firearms, and so they were part of that system too. So what would basically happen is that every month, the leader of this CJIS organization, for which I was a project manager, would ask us to put together a very positive status report of how the project was going, make a product presentation of what we had accomplished, where we were in the process, give a positive status report, and then have a question answer quasi-meeting question discussion period where he avoided agency conflict. So they would all come sit around the table, and he, the leader of the CJIS organization, would run the steering committee meeting. And his mandate was to present a positive picture of how things were going and avoid any interagency conflict with his project managers and leaders from all the agencies, and he would do this once a month. There was no two-way communication. He didn't want to hear from anyone. He didn't want to address any issues. Now, this, you can see all the things that are wrong with this, I'm sure. He didn't have a defined project. He didn't have any participation from the people in these organizations. They weren't represented in his design group. They weren't represented in his working group. He was, as a technologist, he was flying blind without getting any business input from any of his business leaders. He was building something that was completely disconnected from his business user, and he didn't have any of the documentation in the middle that would link what his agencies needed to what he was building. And he, so therefore, he really couldn't, he couldn't have a steering committee that he was honestly working with. So his steering committee was basically just a sham to keep things rolling along. And periodically, his Xerox project manager that was on site would call his division president and have his division president have an ad hoc meeting with the Connecticut Undersecretary for Criminal Justice and say, look, if they can't pull something together and tell us what they want to build and stick with it, we're going to have to walk away, because the requirements were all staying so fluid and so fuzzy that the vendor couldn't build anything and stick to it. So this is where a steering committee, a governance committee board, was put in place as kind of a sham, just kind of a cover-up for a project that wasn't working, didn't work, and couldn't work, was destined to fail. UCONN Health. This was an internal project. What this was about was a professor at the UCONN Health Center for Public Health and Health Policy wrote a grant to build something called the Preschool to 20 Workforce Integration Network that UCONN Health would drive and integrate the workforce initiatives of the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, and the Board of Regents to interconnect all of them into preschool to age 20 integrated workforce initiative network. And he wrote a grant, put this together, brought these people to the table, these agencies to the table. His his development partners were the University of Connecticut Booth Engineering Center for Advanced Technology that built a probability matching engine, a piece of software that used that matched people on the probability that they matched, not on the exactitude of a match. So it was a fuzzy matching engine, so that they could get matches between the databases in the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, and the Board of Regents. So they could build a life cycle database of people that started in preschool all the way to age 20, with all the name change possibilities and misspellings and all that. And a company called Open Clinica to wrap an application around that probability matching engine. They had no requirements traceability matrix. UCONN Health was the sponsor. There was a steering committee. There was no PMO because this was just a project brought together from agencies that was just a grant residing within the UCONN Health Center. The working groups were these projects that were already ongoing in these three agencies. And the development team was, as I said, BCAT, Open Clinica, and the UCONN Health was the project management team. That was me on behalf of this professor. The transactionally, it was the customer and kind of an internal provider, because Open Clinica provided a lot of things for us, and UCONN BCAT was part of UCONN, so it was still part of the University of Connecticut. The situation was very congenial. There was no shared agency commitment. There was little value to the vendor. Open Clinica was barely getting paid. And there was low interest from BCAT. They were only doing it as a trial run on their probability engine so they could incorporate it into their PLOS One paper that they were writing for submission to PLOS One. In terms of competition, there was lots of interagency confusion. Each one of these three agencies had their own agenda. They had the vision for their own workforce initiatives that they didn't share. And the priority for the project was only from UCONN Health. The professor that designed this project, it was only for UCONN Health to try out this probability engine so they could use it in other grant programs. No one else really shared the vision for this except him. There was no shared commitment. It was not adequately resourced, and I, as the project manager, had no resource authority to pull together any resources to get it done. The only way that I could get it done is by cajoling and encouraging cooperation. I had no real authority, and there was no shared commitment. The project steering committee, the mandate was to monitor, scope, schedule, and budget of the project and mitigate risk, resolve issues, but also to bolster commitment for the project, kind of increase morale, be a cheerleader for the project, and diffuse interagency conflict. It contained agency leaders, Open Clinica, and myself as the UCONN Health project manager, and we met weekly. Ultimately, the team fell apart. There were technical problems with Open Clinica and their ability to wrap an application around this probability engine. And I think the lack of commitment on everyone's part was just like, well, this didn't happen quickly and easily, and so we're just going to go on about doing our own projects. And they really didn't care if the grant fell apart or they met the expectations or not. So it was a lack of shared commitment. And through the steering committee, one of the things that I was trying to do was generate shared commitment, but I was unable to do that. Finally, Northwell Health. Northwell Health Solutions Division. So the primary customer was the population health care management programs that were within the Health Solutions Division. There was the New York State Department of Health Medicare Health Home, Accountable Care Analytics, Mobile Health Joint Ventures, and the Healthix and RIO integration. RIO is Regional Health regional health integration organization. These 4 were my programs. Another project manager had these 3: transitional care, bundle value-based programs, and payer value-based programs. And then another project manager had DISRIP. The vendor was Allscripts. They were on site. They used the Agile methodology. They were dedicated to Northwell Health Solutions Division and other divisions. The way one of these programs were structured is there would be a program medical doctor as the sponsor. There were steering committees for every program. There was an informatics team acting as the PMO. There was a quarterly planning group. And then there were Agile teams of Allscripts developers. The transactional customer-provider relationship was congenial, but there were always resource stresses. Competitively, the varieties of the different programs, the agendas, there was a lot of variety of the agendas. There was always, the vision was clear. The revenue generation was everyone's vision, but there were different resource priorities. There were no matrix teams. There were never enough resources, no sponsor input into priorities. The medical doctor at the top, no combined alignment of priorities among the sponsors. And they didn't level set sponsor expectations because they lacked a project portfolio management. So this is what would happen. Every week, the project managers would have for each of their programs a program steering committee meeting. And the mandate of this this steering committee meeting, was to monitor scope, schedule, and budget, get reports on those, resolve any issues, but mostly to provide clear requirements clarification and to establish intra-program priorities. So the MD of this program, for instance, Medicare Health Home, from the Department of Health, New York State Department of Health, there may be a lot of different sub-programs within that, or sub-requirements within that. And it was the job of this weekly steering committee to establish which requirements or which sub-program aspects were higher priority or needed to be done, and clarify the requirements associated with that and resolve issues associated with that. And then the overall project scope, schedule, and budget for all of the aspects of that program. The membership of that team were program leaders, Allscripts development people, and some subject matter experts. So this went on week after week after week after week. And then once a quarter, there would be a quarterly planning governance board in which we would establish the inter-program priorities across all of those programs and establish the work effort for all of those programs. And that was handled between Allscripts and the program managers. So basically, the 3 program managers that handled, and I handled these 4, the other program manager handled these 3, and then the third handled, that all of us 3 project managers would get together and fight it out, kind of like on the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. We would fight it out with Allscripts to get our projects in priority for quarterly planning for development with Allscripts, and establish how much time it would take to get this work done and that work done and this work done and that work done, to lay out their Agile backlog for their quarterly work. And so what would happen is that the doctors at these various programs would depend on us to get their work in the queue for that quarter's work. And the leader of the Health Solutions Division and the various program MDs would never get involved in setting priorities and what work got done when, because they lacked a project portfolio management process. They weren't involved in setting the alignments and setting the program strategies, and that was a big failing of the project. That this quarterly planning should have been more of a strategic steering committee instead of just a technical working group. And so that was a big failing of this process. So, sorry, I only have 9 minutes left or 4 minutes left, but that's an overview of some steering committees that I've worked with in the past.
Thank you so much, April. We really appreciate that. Let's see, do we have any questions?
Cheshire, Connecticut, thank you, 2007. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, April. I just have a general comment.
Sean did say that these
are... Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It looks like from all of your experiences with these 4 examples that the key to success seems to be shared commitment across the board.
Shared commitment, yes,
that's the theme.
Shared commitment and honest, open communication.
Yes.
If you can get your steering committees to facilitate that, then you'll stand a far greater chance of success. Because, you know, my watchword with steering committees seems to work in every situation. Bad news doesn't get better with age. It's not like a fine wine. The sooner you get bad news out on the table, the sooner you can recover from the consequences. And that's always super critical in projects. And in terms of risk management, the sooner you know that something is going wrong or may go wrong, the sooner you can start mitigating and recovering from that bad news. So don't be afraid of bad news. It doesn't get better with age. It's not going to magically go away on its own. Just face it honestly and get it out on the table. Because you can only prevaricate about it for so long or hide it for so long.
It's really good advice. Thank you.
Yep. So if anybody thinks of anything, you know, this is a lot of information, but I'll send these out. And if anybody thinks of anything or wants to know anything about any of this stuff, I suppose my email will be available. And, you know, you're more than welcome to write me, open up a conversation about anything. I'll be more than happy to continue the conversation offline. And oh, by the way, if anybody wants to know more about the project portfolio management process, I have a presentation about that and we'll be happy to walk you through what that is and how it works. Because I've mentioned it several times and I have nothing about it in detail in the presentation, but would be happy to have a little, you know, presentation about that sometime if you want to do it.
Wonderful. Maybe we'll invite you back for one of our monthly webinars in 2021.
Okay.
Yeah. Just a couple little housekeeping things just to let you know. We are going to go on lunch now till 1 p.m. And then we do have a presentation by Lori Fox from SUNY Geneseo at 1 p.m. And then our breakout room activity that we're going to be doing. You all should have received an email with your breakout room assignment in your email just recently, just to let you know. It has some links. You're going to want to save that so that you have access to the Google Docs and Google Slides to do your activity. The only other thing I'd like to ask is if any of you are not coming back for the breakout rooms, could you let me know by raising your hand? It's at the bottom of your presentation screen. That way we can reassign people so that we can make sure that everybody is in a proper breakout room and we have a good number. I do see a couple people raising their hands. Thank you. Is there anybody else that won't be coming back from the activity? If you could raise your hand or put it in the discussion forum, I would really appreciate it so that we can move people around. So, all right, I think that's about it. And thank you everybody for joining us. Have a great lunch and we'll see you back at 1 p.m.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Very much.